Can tears turn fear into trust? What will the massive cowboy do with the sobbing farmhand? Prologue, the moment before everything changed. He was crying so hard, he didn't hear the barn door open. That was the thing Jesse Merritt would remember for years afterward. Not the humiliation of being caught, not the cold October air that rushed in with the squeal of old iron hinges, not even the shadow that fell across him like a wall. He would remember, most of all, that he had been crying so completely, so totally surrendered to it, that the world outside his own grief had simply ceased to exist. And then it didn't. And then there was Eli Calloway, all 6 feet 4 inches of him, filling the doorframe like something carved out of the land itself. Jesse scrambled upright from the hay bale where he'd crumpled. His sleeve went to his face so fast he nearly hit himself. The lantern light caught the wet tracks on his cheeks anyway. There was no hiding them. There was no hiding anything. Crouched in a stranger's barn at 9 o'clock at night with nowhere left to go and not enough money in his pocket to pretend otherwise. He pressed his back against the wooden slat and waited for whatever came next, an order to leave, a hard word, maybe just silence and the door swinging shut again. Eli didn't do any of those things. He stood in the doorway for a long, unreadable moment, one massive hand still resting on the iron latch. The lantern flame between them trembled. The horses in their stalls shifted and breathed. And then the biggest man Jesse had ever seen in his life did the last thing Jesse expected. He walked in, sat down on the hay bale across the aisle and said quietly, "You eaten today?" Jesse blinked. The question was so practical, so utterly absent of judgment, that it took him 3 full seconds to process it. "No, sir," he finally managed. Eli nodded once, like that answered something. He pulled his hat off and set it on his knee, and he looked down at the ground between his boots the way a man looks when he's decided not to look at you on purpose, because looking at you right now might make things worse. "Kitchen's warm," he said. "Come on when you're ready." He stood, put his hat back on, and walked out the same way he'd come in. He didn't look back. He didn't need to. The Calloway Ranch sat at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud every time it rained, which was often enough in that part of eastern Montana that Jesse had learned to keep his boots scraped clean by the time he reached the porch. He'd arrived 3 weeks before that night in the barn, 3 weeks that felt simultaneously like 3 months and 3 days, the way time does when you're dropped into a life that is not your own and forced to find your footing in it. He'd come in response to a handwritten index card tacked to the bulletin board at the feed store in Cutter Creek. Farmhand needed, room and board provided, hard work expected. Inquire at Calloway Ranch, milepost 14, Route 9. No phone number, no email, just a name and a road. Jesse had stood there in the feed store for a long moment, his duffel bag on the floor beside him and his last $40 folded in his front pocket, and he'd thought, well, it's a direction at least. He had not known, walking up that dirt road for the first time, what he was walking into. He'd imagined an old man, weathered and terse, the kind who'd assign work and then disappear into the house and not speak to him again until something went wrong. That was the rancher archetype he'd built from old westerns and one summer spent working a peach orchard in Georgia. Quiet men, sunburned men, men who communicated mostly through the direction they pointed a shovel. What he got was Eli Calloway, who was 26 years old, broad-shouldered enough to block a doorway without trying, and who had looked at Jesse's slight frame and then at his face and said, without cruelty, "You done ranch work before." "Some," Jesse had said, which was approximately 40% true. Eli had looked at him for another moment, not sizing him up meanly, just the way a man looks when he's trying to make an honest assessment of a situation, and then he'd said, "All right, I'll show you the work. You keep up, you stay. You don't, I'll tell you straight and we'll part clean." That was Eli's way. Jesse would come to understand it over the following weeks, that particular combination of bluntness and fairness, the way he never said more than he meant but also never meant anything cruel. It was such a strange and specific kind of honesty that Jesse, who had grown up around people who used honesty as a weapon, took a while to trust it at all. The room Jesse was given was above the stable, small, warm, with a single window that looked out over the east pasture. There was a bed with a quilt that smelled like cedar, and a chest of drawers that stuck on the left side if you pulled it straight. The bathroom was shared at the end of the hall. Eli had shown him all of it in about 4 minutes and then said, "Breakfast at 6. Don't be late because I don't recook," and walked away. Jesse had stood in the small room above the stable and looked out the east window at the last light dying across the pasture and thought, quietly, that it was the most alone he had ever felt in his life. And also, underneath that, like a coal still warm under ash, something that felt almost like relief. The work was hard in a way Jesse hadn't anticipated. Not brutally so, not punishing, but the kind of hard that used muscles he didn't know he had and left him so deeply tired by 8 o'clock every evening that he'd eaten dinner, rinsed his face, and been unconscious before 9 for the first 5 days straight. Eli worked beside him most of the time, which was not what Jesse had expected either. He'd expected to be handed a list and pointed at it. Instead, Eli appeared in the stable each morning at 5:45, already dressed and steady as the land he stood on, and he worked the same hours Jesse did and then some. He repaired the north fence line with the same economy of motion he brought to everything. He moved through the work the way water moves through a channel, not fighting it, not hurrying it, just following the shape of what needed to be done. Jesse watched him, in the way that you watch someone when you're trying to learn a thing from them without admitting you're learning. He noticed that Eli talked to the horses differently than he talked to people, softer, more words, a low continuous sound like he was keeping them company rather than directing them. He noticed that Eli ate lunch sitting on whatever fence or gate was nearest rather than going back to the house, and that he drank his coffee black and strong and poured it from a thermos that had a dent in the left side. He noticed that when something went wrong, a section of wire that turned out to be rotten all the way through, a water trough that had cracked over winter and gone unnoticed, Eli would stop, look at it, release a single slow breath, and then simply adjust and continue. No cursing. No throwing things. Just the quiet, steady absorption of a problem into the ongoing work of fixing it. It made Jesse feel, in a way he couldn't articulate then, slightly ashamed of himself. Not in a pointed way. In the way you feel when you're standing next to something patient and solid, and you realize how jagged and reactive you've been moving through your own life. The conversation between them in those first weeks was functional. Eli told him what needed doing. Jesse asked questions when he had them, which Eli answered plainly and without condescension. They worked side by side for hours, sometimes without speaking at all, and it was the least uncomfortable silence Jesse had ever shared with another person, which unsettled him slightly because he couldn't figure out why. By the end of the second week, Jesse had stopped flinching every time Eli's voice came from behind him. That was progress. Small, quiet progress, but progress. Jesse had not told Eli why he'd come to Cutter Creek. He had not told him much of anything, really, about where he'd come from or what he'd left behind. Eli had not asked. That was another thing about him. He seemed to operate on the principle that a man's past was his own business until the man decided otherwise, and that showing up willing to work was sufficient introduction for the time being. What Jesse had left behind was this: a 2-year relationship with a man named Daniel that had ended so badly, it had left structural damage Jesse was still mapping. A rented room above a bar in Billings that he hadn't been able to afford after the restaurant he'd worked at closed. A family in Oregon who loved him in the complicated, careful way of people who had never quite made their peace with who he was, and who showed that love mostly through long silences and occasional checks that arrived with no note attached. He was 22 years old and felt approximately 40, and he had gotten on a bus headed east with his duffel bag and the feed store index card folded in his pocket because it was the only plan he had, and because moving felt better than staying still. He did not know, sitting on that bus watching the Montana landscape open up around him like a held breath released, that he was going towards something rather than just away from something. He would not know that for a while yet. The evening of the third week, a Friday, Eli made dinner. This happened most evenings. Eli cooked. They ate at the kitchen table, and then one or both of them retreated. The food was never elaborate. Eggs, usually, or chili from a pot that sat on the back of the stove, or thick slabs of bread with butter and whatever was left from the previous night. But it was always good in the honest, unfussy way that food is good when someone makes it with actual attention rather than performance. That Friday, Jesse came in from the stable to find Eli standing at the stove with his sleeves rolled up, stirring something that smelled like onions and garlic, and something deeper underneath. And the kitchen was warm with it, and the window above the sink was fogged with condensation, and the radio on the counter was playing something low and country and old. Jesse stood in the doorway for a moment before Eli noticed him, and he had a feeling he couldn't name, something wide and quiet and slightly dangerous, like standing at the edge of something you hadn't realized was there. 20 minutes, Eli said without turning around. Okay, Jesse said, and went a wash-up. It was the horses that cracked Jesse open first. Eli had 4. The oldest was a bay mare named Clara who had been on the ranch since before Eli's father died, and who treated every human on the property with the mild, tolerant regard of someone who has seen enough to no longer be surprised by anything. The youngest was a gray gelding barely past 2, all legs and nerves and enormous eyes, named Smoke. The other 2, a pair of quarter horses named Sunday and Rye, were working animals, steady, capable, affectionate in the uncomplicated way of animals who have been treated well their whole lives. Jesse had grown up in the city. He had ridden horses twice, at birthday parties, as a child. The extent of his animal experience was a tabby cat named Biscuit who had lived at his grandmother's house and tolerated being held. He had told Eli he had some ranch experience, which had, in the category of horses specifically, been a lie by any reasonable measure. Eli figured this out within approximately 48 hours. He said nothing about it, which somehow made it worse, and simply began showing Jesse what to do with a patience that was neither excessive nor showy, but just there, continuous and unhurried, like the man himself. But it was Smoke who got to Jesse. The young gelding was skittish, not mean, just young and uncertain, startled by shadows and sudden movements and sounds that the older horses had long since catalogued and dismissed. On a Tuesday morning in his third week, Jesse was tasked with brushing Smoke down, and the young horse spooked at something, a bird, a creak in the wood, and shied so hard he nearly knocked Jesse off his feet. Jesse caught himself on the stable wall, heart hammering, and for a stupid, unguarded moment he felt his eyes go hot. He was tired. He was tired in a way that had been building for months before he'd ever arrived here, and it came up now without warning, sharp and humiliating, his throat tightening around it. He gripped the wall and breathed and told himself to get it together. Hey, Eli's voice came from 2 stalls down, low, even not alarmed. Don't tense up. He can feel it. Jesse exhaled slowly. Yeah, he said, sorry. Don't apologize to me. Apologize to him. Jesse blinked. He looked at Smoke, who was standing with his ears back and his eyes wide, still unsettled. On instinct, Jesse let his shoulders drop. He let his hands go soft. He didn't think about it exactly. He just did what seemed needed, extending one hand palm up toward the horse's nose, waiting, saying nothing. Smoke stretched his neck, nosed Jesse's palm once, twice, then settled. Eli came and stood beside Jesse, and they both looked at the horse for a moment. Good, Eli said. It was one word. Jesse filed it somewhere important. They started talking in the evenings. Not deeply, not at first. It began with the practical Eli explaining the history of the property, the rotation of the pastures, the particular stubbornness of the north fence that had been a problem since his father built it wrong in 1987 and had never been properly fixed. Jesse asked questions and Eli answered them. And somewhere in the answering, the conversation began to find its own shape, drifting from fence posts to weather patterns to the kind of sideways talk that circles the things you actually want to say without saying them directly. Jesse learned in this way that Eli had grown up on the ranch and never seriously considered leaving. That his father had died 4 years ago, quickly, a heart attack, no warning, and left the ranch to Eli as the eldest of three, the other two being a sister in Bozeman and a brother who was currently somewhere in Colorado doing something Eli described with a careful neutrality as his own thing. That Eli had a small group of friends in Cutter Creek, men he'd known his whole life, the kind of friendship built from proximity and shared history rather than particular choice. But that he spent most of his time here, on the land, which was exactly where he wanted to be. "You ever get lonely out here?" Jesse asked once, not meaning to, the question coming out before he'd properly reviewed it. Eli looked at him from across the table, not startled, not offended, just considering. "Sometimes," he said, "less than I used to." He didn't explain that. He went back to his dinner. Jesse felt a warm, confusing thing move through his chest and directed his attention firmly at his plate. What Jesse offered in return was carefully curated. He talked about Billings. He talked about the restaurant, the noise and the heat of it, the strange camaraderie of kitchen work. He talked about the bus ride, the way Montana looked at sunrise through smudged windows, which made Eli smile slightly, a private, pleased smile, like a man hearing his home described well by someone who is only beginning to see it. He did not talk about Daniel. He did not talk about his family in Oregon. He did not talk about the particular weight he'd been carrying so long he'd stopped noticing it the way you stop noticing a rucksack until you put it down. But he felt those evenings like maybe the rucksack was getting lighter, not because Eli was doing anything to fix it, just because the kitchen was warm and the coffee was strong, and the man across the table from him was the kind of quiet that feels like company. The night of the barn happened like this. Jesse got a phone call. It was from his mother, not the calls she made sometimes on birthdays or after particularly bad silences, which tended to be brief and effortful and ended with both of them retreating back to their separate distances, but an unexpected call, early evening, that he answered walking back from the stable. She had heard from his uncle, who had heard from someone, that he was working on a ranch in Montana. She was not angry about this. She did not do anger his mother. She did something more efficient, which was concerned disappointment delivered in a gentle tone that always found exactly the tender places. She asked if he was safe. She asked if he was thinking about what came next. She said, carefully, that she had been talking to a friend whose son was now, apparently, very happy, and that she just wanted Jesse to know that there were paths available to him if he ever wanted to think about things differently. Jesse stood in the middle of the dirt path between the stable and the house and understood that she was, in her most gentle way, trying again. He stood there and listened to her voice, which he loved, and felt the old familiar grief of it, the love and the distance of it, the way she said paths like she was offering him a different kind of map, a map to a version of himself she could understand more easily. He said the right things. He said he was fine, that the work was good, that he'd call more often. He said good night. He hung up. And then, because he could not go inside yet and could not stand still, he walked back to the barn, sat down on the hay bale in the dark and cried. Not softly, not with any particular dignity. He cried the way you cry when you've been holding something for months, and a single phone call from someone who loves you imperfectly opens the release valve without warning. He was still crying when the barn door opened. He was still crying when Eli walked in and sat down and asked if he'd eaten. He followed Eli into the kitchen 10 minutes later, face washed and mostly composed, and sat at the table while Eli reheated the leftover chili from 2 nights ago and sliced bread and set it all down without ceremony. He sat across from Jesse and drank his coffee and didn't ask anything. Jesse ate half the bowl before he said, "It was my mom." Eli nodded. It's not bad, we're okay. Jesse stopped, started again. She loves me, she just doesn't always know how to love the version of me that actually exists. He looked up, expecting something, discomfort maybe, the slight recalibration men sometimes did when things went in this direction. He found instead that Eli was looking at him with the same direct, unhurried attention he gave to everything else, and that there was nothing in his expression requiring Jesse to be less than what he'd just said. "That's a hard thing," Eli said. "Yeah," Jesse looked at the table. "It is." They sat with it for a moment, the kind of silence that is not empty but held. "My dad was the same way," Eli said then. "Different reasons, but he loved me in the version of me he thought I was. Took a while to sort out the difference between that and him loving me." Jesse looked at him. There was something careful in how Eli said it, not evasive exactly, but deliberate, the way you put a foot down slowly on uncertain ground. "Did you ever sort it out?" Jesse asked. "Some of it." Eli's mouth moved slightly, not quite a smile, something more internal. "He died before we finished, so." He turned his coffee cup. "You work with what you got." Jesse thought about that for a long time after he went to bed. The honesty of it, the sadness in it, the way Eli had offered it like something ordinary, like grief was just another fence post that needed setting. He lay in the dark above the stable and listened to the horses shifting and breathing below him and felt, for the first time in a long time, less alone. Something shifted after that night. It was subtle, not the dramatic reorganization of two people suddenly seeing each other clearly, but something quieter and more durable, like a door that had previously been kept closed, now being kept slightly ajar. They moved through the work differently. Eli started explaining not just the what but the why, the reasoning behind the pasture rotation, the logic of the fence layout, the particular history of certain parts of the property that mattered to understanding it properly. Jesse started asking questions, not just for the information, but for the sound of Eli talking, the way his voice deepened slightly when he was thinking about something he cared about. They lingered longer at dinner. The evening stopped ending at 8:30. There was a Tuesday when they were repairing the south pasture gate together, working from opposite sides of the post, and Jesse handed Eli a wrench handle first, and their hands touched for a second, Eli's broad and calloused, Jesse's narrower but no longer as soft as they'd been, and neither of them moved for a half-beat longer than the moment required. Jesse looked up. Eli was already looking at him. The contact broke. They both went back to the gate. Jesse stood on his side of the post and worked the bolt and did not think about it. He was very focused on not thinking about it. There was a Thursday when it rained so hard they couldn't work outside, and Eli spent the afternoon in the workshop at the back of the barn repairing a section of tack, and Jesse sat on the workbench and talked to him while he worked, properly talked, the way they hadn't entirely done yet, about childhood things, stupid things, the kind of conversation that builds foundations without either person noticing the construction happening. Jesse told him about the summer he was 12 and became briefly and embarrassingly obsessed with astronomy. Eli told him about learning to drive a tractor at 8 and rolling it into the ditch the first time in his father's face when he came to pull it out. "Was he furious?" Jesse asked. "I thought he would be." Eli threaded the leather needle with a slow, careful hand. "He just looked at the tractor in the ditch for a long time and then looked at me and said, 'You hurt?' And I said, 'No, sir.' And he said, 'Then we're fine. Help me get the chain.'" Jesse looked at him. "That's a good dad story." "Yeah," Eli said. He didn't say anything else for a moment, and the rain was loud on the barn roof. He had his good ones. There was a man named Cole. Cole Brand had grown up with Eli. They'd gone to the same school, worked on neighboring properties, shared the kind of history that small towns produce between people whether they choose it or not. He was tall, easy-looking, with a rancher's confidence and a smile that arrived quickly and filled rooms. He came by the ranch on a Saturday in late October to borrow a come-along from Eli's shop, and he found Jesse in the yard stacking firewood and stopped. "New hand," he said, in the friendly, unworried way of a man who has never had to be worried about anything. "Jesse Merritt," Jesse said. Cole introduced himself and leaned against the fence post in the way of a man who has decided there's no hurry, and he talked to Jesse while Jesse stacked wood, and he was perfectly pleasant, perfectly easy, and he asked good questions and listened to the answers, and Jesse found himself liking him against his will because there was nothing not to like. Eli came out of the shop about 10 minutes later with the come-along and stopped when he saw them, and his expression did something small and quick that Jesse caught only because he'd gotten good at reading that face over the last 4 weeks. It was there and gone in under a second. It wasn't unfriendly. It wasn't even obviously anything. It was just a pause, a tiny recalibration. "Cole," he said. "Eli, nice kid you got out here." Cole gestured toward Jesse easily. "Kid's got a good stack going." "He does," Eli said. He handed over the come-along. "You need anything else?" Cole looked between them. A smile moved slowly across his face, not malicious, not pointed, just the smile of a man who notices things. "No," he said. "I think I got everything I came for." After Cole's truck had backed down the dirt road and disappeared, Eli stood in the yard for a moment. He said, without particular emphasis, "Cole's all right." "Yeah, seems like it," Jesse said. Eli nodded. He looked at the woodpile. "You've got the third row going a bit uneven. Line them against the wall first." He went back inside. Jesse looked at the woodpile for a moment. Then he started relining the third row. He worked slowly and he was smiling a little, and he had absolutely no idea why, except that something about the last 10 minutes had done something to the cold, and the day felt warmer than it had an hour ago. November came in hard and early that year. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in 3 days, and the pasture grass went stiff with frost, and the horses grew their winter coats and breathed white clouds into the morning air. Jesse's body had, by now, genuinely adjusted to the work. The soreness of the first weeks had been replaced by a different kind of physical awareness, a knowing of his own muscles, a competence in his hands and his posture that he hadn't had before. He'd stopped feeling like an interloper. That surprised him. He'd expected the ranch to always feel borrowed, temporary, because everything in his life had felt temporary for so long that he'd stopped anticipating permanence. But he woke up mornings and knew exactly where he was without the half-second of disorientation that had marked the first 2 weeks, and he walked to the stable in the dark without a flashlight because he knew the path now, and the horses came to him when he entered, and Clara knocked her big head against his shoulder in greeting the way she did with Eli. And one morning he was repairing the water line at the North Trough, and he thought, without particularly choosing to, "I could stay here." He was sitting with that thought, still surprised by it, a little frightened of it, when Eli came around the corner of the trough with a length of pipe and crouched down beside him. "Cold snap's not breaking until Thursday," Eli said. "We should wrap the east line tonight." "Yeah," Jesse said. He was still somewhere else, still with the thought. Eli looked at him sideways. He had a way of doing that, a peripheral attention that registered more than it appeared to. "You all right?" "Yeah," Jesse came back. "Yeah, sorry, just thinking." "About?" Jesse looked at him. In the cold morning light, Eli's face was very clear, the strong jaw, the eyes that were a brown so dark they were nearly black, the particular stillness of him that Jesse had come to find, against all expectation, more comfortable than most people's expressiveness. "About staying," Jesse said. He hadn't planned to say it. It just came out, honest and slightly exposed, because apparently that was who he was becoming out here. Something crossed Eli's face, quick, warm, carefully controlled. "Ranch could use it," he said. He looked back at the pipe fitting. "Hand me the wrench." Jesse handed him the wrench, and they worked side by side on the water line in the frozen morning, and neither of them said anything else about it. But the thing had been said, and it was out there now in the cold air between them, and it didn't go anywhere. The trouble came from inside Jesse, the way it usually did. There was a night in the second week of November, a Friday, late, the wind loud against the windows, when Jesse lay in his room above the stable and stared at the ceiling and tried to take stock of himself honestly. He did this sometimes. It was not a comfortable practice. The inventory tended to surface things he'd rather have left in the back of the drawer. He was falling for Eli Calloway. He'd known it in pieces for a while, known it the way you know a thing before you'll let yourself name it, the way you look away from something bright because numbing it makes it real and real things can be lost. But lying there in the dark, listening to the wind, he couldn't pretend otherwise anymore. He thought about Eli constantly, thought about his voice, his hands, the way he moved through difficulty with that particular gravity, the evenings at the kitchen table, the moment their hands had touched over the wrench. He thought about the expression on Eli's face when Cole Brandt had been talking to Jesse in the yard, that small, quick, recalibrated look. And he thought about what it might have meant, and then immediately stopped thinking about what it might have meant because hope was a ledge he'd stepped off before and knew better than to approach. Because here was what was also true. He didn't know. He did not know who Eli was in this way, and he had no reliable instinct anymore for reading these things, not after Daniel, who had been charm and certainty in the beginning, and something else entirely by the end. He didn't trust his own reading. He didn't trust the warmth of the kitchen and the lingered evenings and the ways Eli looked at him to mean what part of him wanted them to mean. And there was the larger thing underneath all of it, the ranch. This room. The first place in years that had felt like something approaching ground. If he was wrong about any of it, if he spoke or moved or let the thing he felt become visible and he was wrong, there was no recovering the ground. The ranch would become untenable. The room would stop being a room and become a mistake. He would be back on a bus with a duffel bag and $40, and this time there wouldn't even be an index card to point him somewhere. So he would be careful. He would be steady. He would be the farmhand and nothing else, and he would put the feeling back in the drawer and close the drawer and work the land until it covered over. He told himself this convincingly for exactly 4 days. The thing that broke the 4 days was entirely ordinary, which was somehow the worst part. They were in the workshop on a Tuesday afternoon, Jesse oiling a section of harness, Eli replacing the handle on a post driver, and the radio was on, some old station that played songs Jesse half recognized from his mother's house, and one of them came on that he knew all the words to without meaning to, a slow, aching thing about distance and coming home, and he was mouthing the words without thinking about it when he looked up and found Eli watching him. Not quickly, not with the sideways peripheral attention, directly, fully, the way Eli almost never looked at anything with that complete, quiet focus usually reserved for things he was trying to understand. Jesse stopped. The harness section was still in his hands. The song was still playing. The lantern threw their shadows long against the workshop wall, and for a moment neither of them moved or spoke or looked away. Then Eli turned back to the post driver handle. "Good song," he said. "Yeah," Jesse said barely. He went back to the harness. His hands were not quite steady. He focused on making them steady and mostly succeeded. The song finished and another one came on and the lantern burned and Eli worked on the handle, and Jesse thought, with a helpless clarity he couldn't shut off, "I am in serious trouble." He started pulling back. He didn't mean to do it badly. He meant to do it quietly, the way you manage a thing carefully, keeping everything functional and professional while building a little distance, a little breathable air. He thought he was doing it subtly. He was not doing it subtly. The evenings got shorter. Jesse started finding reasons to finish dinner faster, to excuse himself earlier, citing tiredness that was not entirely false but not entirely true either. He stopped sitting on the fence rail beside Eli in the mornings with his coffee. He answered questions and did his work and was polite and reliable and closed. He was very good at closed. He'd had a lot of practice. Eli noticed. Jesse could see it, not in anything Eli said, because Eli didn't press or probe, but in the slight, adjusting stillness of him, the way the kitchen evenings became quieter and more functional and less whatever they had been becoming. Eli absorbed the withdrawal the way he absorbed everything else, without fighting it, just accommodating its shape, adjusting the space between them to match what Jesse was offering. Which somehow made it worse. Jesse had half expected Eli to push back to ask what was wrong, or act differently, or give him something to react to. Instead, he got steadiness, patience, that undemanding presence that just kept being there and kept being decent and kept making Jesse feel like the jagged, difficult one. He lay in his room at night and argued with himself and went to work in the morning and was careful and correct and hated it. On a Thursday evening, 9 days into the withdrawal, Eli put 2 mugs of coffee on the kitchen table, sat down, and said, "You're allowed to just tell me." Jesse looked at him. "Tell you what?" "Whatever you're moving away from." Eli's hands were around his mug. He wasn't looking at Jesse exactly. He was looking at the space between them, the table, which was a courtesy. "I'm not going to make it harder, but you don't have to manage me." Jesse felt something crack slightly in his chest. "I'm not," he started. "You are," Eli said, not unkindly, just factually. "That's okay, but you don't have to." The silence stretched. The house settled around them in the wind. "I don't know how to say it," Jesse finally said. "You don't have to say it tonight," Eli said. He picked up his coffee. "Just stop managing the distance. That part's worse." Jesse sat there for a moment. He said, "Okay." He didn't know what okay meant yet exactly. But the pulling back stopped that night, and the evenings began to breathe again, and something between them settled back into itself, close but still unnamed, warm but still careful. December arrived with snow. Jesse had not seen snow like this since actually, he wasn't sure he'd seen snow like this at all. He stood at the east window of his room the first morning of it, watching the pasture disappear under white, and felt something lift in him that he hadn't known was weighted down. He was outside before breakfast, standing in it, tilting his face up, and he didn't care how young it made him look. The cold was absolute and clean, and the world had been remade overnight into something simplified and still. Eli found him out there and stood beside him for a moment, looking at the white pasture. "Worst part about it is the frozen water lines," he said. "Best part about it is everything else," Jesse said. Eli looked at him with that small, internal-facing smile. "City kid," he said, not unkindly. "Guilty," Jesse said. They stood in the snow for another minute before the horses needed attending, and standing there Jesse thought that this was enough, this exact thing, this cold and white and the man standing beside him, that it was more than enough, that if this was what he got to keep, then the keeping of it was worth the discipline required. He believed that more or less entirely, for about another 2 weeks. Cole Brandt came back on a Saturday in mid-December, this time with 3 other men from town, for what turned out to be a tradition Jesse hadn't known about, an annual early winter gathering at the Calloway Ranch, informal, built around a bonfire in the yard and good whiskey, and the particular looseness of men who have known each other their whole lives. Jesse hadn't been warned. He came out of the stable at dusk to find the yard full of pickup trucks and the bonfire already going, and 4 men he didn't know standing around it with drinks. He stopped. His first instinct was retreat, to say he was tired, to find an excuse. But Cole had already seen him and called out, and there was nothing for it. The men were easy. They were the same kind as Cole, third-generation ranchers, unflappable, with the specific social ease of people who have never needed to be anything other than what they are. They included Jesse without effort or ceremony, handed him a drink, asked questions without prying, and moved him into the conversation as naturally as if he'd always been there. Jesse relaxed, slowly, by degrees. The fire was enormous and the night was very cold and the whiskey was good, and after the first hour something in his shoulders let go. At some point he became aware that Eli had moved to stand beside him specifically. Not across the fire, not talking to someone else, beside him, close enough that Jesse could feel the warmth of him even in the cold. And when one of the other men made a joke that made Jesse laugh, Eli's shoulder pressed briefly against his and didn't move away. Jesse kept his eyes on the fire. He was aware of every millimeter of that contact, with the supersensitive precision of someone trying very hard to act normal. Later, when the others had gone inside and it was just the two of them banking the fire, Cole said something to Eli, low, private, a comment Jesse wasn't meant to hear, and Eli said something back in the same tone, and Cole laughed and looked at Jesse with that noticing smile and said to Jesse directly, "You're good for him." Jesse opened his mouth and closed it. "I don't." "I'm not saying anything," Cole said, raising his hands. "Just saying." He clapped Eli on the shoulder and went inside. Eli looked at the Coles. He had a particular stillness in that moment that was different from his usual steadiness. It was the stillness of a man who is working very hard not to react to something. "Cole talks," he said. "Yeah," Jesse said. A long moment, the fire crackled, an ember floated up and died. "He's not wrong, though," Eli said very quietly to the Coles. Jesse's heart stopped, briefly, definitely. He felt it stop and then restart faster. "Eli," he started. "You don't have to say anything," Eli said, same quiet tone. "I'm not asking you to." He picked up the poker and moved a log, "just telling you." He went inside. Jesse stood at the dying fire for a while in the cold, and the stars were enormous above him, and the snow was orange-lit at the edges from the coals, and he stood there with his whole chest rearranged and no idea what to do with any of it. They moved around the revelation carefully for 4 days, the way you move around something valuable you're afraid to knock over. Nothing was said again, but everything was different. There was a charge in the air between them now, a specific awareness, the kind that only exists once a thing has been named and can't be unnamed. Jesse caught Eli looking at him and didn't look away. Eli passed close behind him in the stable once and paused for a moment, just a moment, not long at all, and then continued, and Jesse stood with his hand on Clara's flank and breathed. He wanted to say something. He had been composing conversations in his head for 4 days. The conversations always started clean and ended somewhere he couldn't quite see. He was afraid. Not of Eli, not of the ranch, not of any of the practical things. He was afraid of himself, of his own capacity to want something wrong, to read a thing as one thing and have it be another, to open himself up to something and find it couldn't hold him. Daniel had been a very effective teacher of fear. Jesse had been an excellent student. On the 4th day, a Wednesday, they were pulling the last of the season's hay into the upper stable loft, and it was hard work, physical and dusty, and halfway through Jesse slipped on the ladder, not badly. He caught himself, but his hand slid and he came down 2 rungs fast before catching the rail, and Eli's hand was on his shoulder before he'd even fully registered what had happened, steadying him, firm and immediate. And then Jesse was standing on the ladder, and Eli was just below him, and Eli's hand was still on his shoulder, and they were very close and looking at each other. Jesse's heart was loud in his own ears. "You okay?" Eli said. "Yeah," Jesse said. He was looking at Eli's face, which was very near. "Yeah, I'm fine." Neither of them moved. The hay dust moved in the cold air around them. The horses shifted below. The moment stretched and stretched. Eli's hand was warm even through Jesse's jacket. And then Jesse's nerve broke in the good direction, or the terrifying direction, which turned out to be the same thing, and he said, barely audible, "Eli." Just his name, no more than that. But in the way he said it, with everything unspoken attached, all 4 days of it, all the weeks before, Eli understood. He stepped down off the ladder slowly. His hand left Jesse's shoulder. He stood below in the stable and looked up at Jesse on the ladder, and his face was doing something complicated and careful, and something else underneath all of that. something Jesse had never quite seen on him before. "Come down," Eli said. Jesse came down. They stood in the stable with hay dust in the air and the winter light coming through the high window, and it was very quiet between them. "I've been in this place before," Jesse said. He was looking at the floor, "where I wanted something and I was wrong about it, and it cost a lot." He looked up at Eli. "So I need you to be straight with me, because I can't do another reading wrong." Eli looked at him for a long time. His expression was not closed, not performing anything, just what it was. "I'm not a man who says things he doesn't mean," he said. "I know," Jesse said. "I know you're not, that's why I'm asking." A pause. "What are you asking exactly?" Eli said. It was such a careful, honest question, not retreating from it, not forcing Jesse to say less, just asking for precision because precision was what was needed here. Jesse felt something fierce and frightened in his chest. "I'm asking if what Cole said, if what you said, is what I think it is," Jesse said, "or if I'm building something out of nothing again." Eli looked at him steadily. "You're not building it out of nothing," he said. The words were quiet and even and absolutely certain. Jesse felt them land somewhere central, somewhere deep. "Okay," Jesse said. His voice wasn't entirely even. "Okay," Eli said. They stood there, the horses breathed, the winter light moved. I should tell you something," Eli said. He turned his hat in his hands, the first fidgeting Jesse had ever seen from him. This isn't something I don't have a lot of practice with it." Jesse looked at him. "Being honest about it," Eli clarified. "Out here with people I've known my whole life, I've kept it," he stopped, "quiet for a long time." Jesse understood what he was saying, the weight of it, the years of managing and containing, which Jesse knew in his own body, knew well. "Yeah," Jesse said softly, "me too. In the other direction, being too loud about it before I figured out who was safe, got burned for it." He paused. "We've had different problems with the same thing." Something in Eli's expression shifted, a recognition, a relief, the particular loosening of someone who has expected not to be understood and has been anyway. "Yeah," he said quietly, "I think that's right." Nothing happened that day in the way things happen in stories. There was no crossing of the distance, no dramatic moment that resolved everything cleanly. What happened instead was that they stood in the stable and talked, slowly and carefully, the way two people talk when they are picking up something fragile and want to hold it right. Jesse told him about Daniel, not everything, not in detail, but the shape of it, the damage of it, the specific way it had trained him to doubt his own instincts. Eli listened with the same focused, unhurried attention he brought to everything, and he didn't fill the silences with reassurance, just let them exist, which was somehow more comforting than reassurance would have been. Eli talked about his father, about the years of containment, of being the steady, reliable one, the one who held the ranch and the family together and did not complicate things by being difficult, about the exhaustion of that, about how after his father died he'd thought, quietly, that he had space to live more honestly, and then had found that the habit of containment was its own kind of infrastructure, hard to dismantle without knowing what to put in its place. "You've been alone out here a long time," Jesse said. "Not lonely," Eli said. "There's a difference." "But alone." Eli was quiet for a moment. "Yeah," he said, "alone." They looked at each other, and the thing between them was no longer unspoken, no longer unnamed, and it was frightening in the way new things are frightening. Not because they are dangerous, but because they are real, and real things require you to be real back. "I don't want to rush anything," Jesse said. "I really don't. What we've had these weeks, it matters. I don't want to wreck it by moving wrong." "You're not going to wreck it," Eli said. "I might," Jesse said. Eli almost smiled. "You might. So might I, but you're also not going to leave us stuck exactly here because you're afraid of it." He looked at Jesse directly. "Are you?" Jesse looked at him. This massive, patient, honest man who had let him cry in a barn and fed him soup and taught him horses and kept the fire burning all through the cold fall, until Jesse had found himself warm, genuinely warm, without knowing exactly when it had happened. "No," Jesse said, "I'm not." The days that followed were a different kind of slow burn, something openly acknowledged now, which changed everything and nothing at the same time. The work was still the work. The mornings were still cold and early and full of frost-bitten fence posts and horses that needed feeding. But the evenings were different. The kitchen was different. The way they moved around each other had acquired a new quality, careful still, but not the careful of people managing an unspoken thing, the careful of people not wanting to rush something they both understood to be worth taking slowly. There were hands touching at the table, nothing dramatic passing a dish, and the contact lasting a moment longer than it needed to, sitting beside each other instead of across. The horses noticed, in whatever way horses notice things. Smoke, who had been skittish since the day Jesse arrived, started coming readily to Jesse now, pressing his big gray nose into Jesse's palm with the confidence of an animal who has decided you belong. One evening, a Friday, the fire was going in the living room, a room Jesse had rarely been in before, a formal space that Eli seemed to treat as mostly decorative. And Eli had built the fire for the first time and put a record on the old player in the corner, and they were sitting together on the couch and talking about something inconsequential, and Jesse fell asleep. He woke up an hour later to find the fire lower, the record finished, and a blanket over him. Eli was still sitting in the armchair nearby, reading, the lamp low beside him. He looked up when Jesse stirred. "You were out," he said. "Sorry," Jesse said, disoriented. "Don't be." Eli set the book down. "You needed it." Jesse looked at him across the warm room, drowsy and disarmed, the guard entirely down. "You stayed," he said. Eli looked at him with an expression Jesse had no good words for, something quiet and settled and undefended. "Yeah," he said, "I stayed." Christmas came. Jesse had not thought about it until 3 days before, when he realized with a mild shock that he had been so absorbed in the life of the ranch that he had entirely lost track of the calendar. He called his mother on the 23rd. The call was better than usual, still careful, still effortful in places, but warmer. She asked about the work, and he described it with enough detail that she laughed once, surprised at the image of him learning to shoe a horse. She said she was glad he was somewhere good. She said it like she meant it. He said he was glad, too. He hung up and stood on the porch in the cold for a moment and thought about paths, the word she'd used. He thought that she was right in her way. There were paths. He had found one. It did not look like the paths she'd had in mind, but it had led him somewhere real. On Christmas Eve, Eli drove into Cutter Creek and came back with a Douglas fir strapped to the truck bed that was too tall by at least a foot for the living room ceiling, but which he trimmed at the base with a cheerfulness Jesse found entirely charming. They spent the evening decorating it with mismatched ornaments from a cardboard box in the closet, all old, all from Eli's childhood, all slightly worn, each one with a story Eli told in pieces. A red tin ball that had survived 3 generations of Callaways, a clay handprint from when Eli was 6 that had clearly been made in school and kept for sentimental reasons, a small wooden horse that had been carved by Eli's grandfather. Jesse held the wooden horse carefully and said, "This one matters." "Yeah," Eli said. He was watching Jesse hold it. "It does." Jesse looked up. The tree lights were on and the room was full of them, and Eli was standing close, closer than the ornament hanging required, and his expression was the open, unguarded one that Jesse only saw sometimes and always wanted to see again. Jesse hung the wooden horse on the branch nearest the center of the tree, carefully, where it would be safe. The worst storm of the winter came in the first week of January without much warning. The forecasters had predicted snow. They got snow and then something worse, a wind that dropped the temperature to conditions where exposed skin was a liability, and the horses couldn't be left in the pasture at all. Jesse and Eli brought all 4 horses into the stable at midnight, working together in the dark and cold with flashlights, and by 2 in the morning they had the animals secure, and the barn insulated as well as it could be, and there was nothing to do but go inside. They were both soaked, both cold past the point where cold is just uncomfortable and into the point where your hands stop working right and your face goes numb in patches. Eli started the kitchen stove and Jesse made coffee, and they sat at the table and thawed in stages, too tired for much speech, and the storm was loud outside and the house was warm inside, and Jesse thought, "This is the thing. This is exactly the thing I was afraid to lose. Right here. This kitchen and this warmth and this man." At some point, Eli reached across the table and put his hand over Jesse's. It was simple. It was not a production. He just put his hand there over both of Jesse's, and Jesse turned one of his hands over and they sat like that, both warming, the storm outside doing what storms do. "I'm glad you came up that road," Eli said. Jesse looked at their hands, then at Eli's face. "Me too," he said. "I was so scared that night walking up it." "You didn't look scared." "I was terrified," Jesse smiled. "I was absolutely terrified. I just needed somewhere to go." "You found somewhere," Eli said. Jesse looked at him, and the firelight and the kitchen warmth and the whole accumulated weight of 5 months sat behind that look. The hay bale and the soup and the horses and the wooden Christmas ornament and the hand over his hand now in the storm. And he said, as quietly as he had ever said anything, "Yeah, I did." The days that followed the storm were clear and bitter cold, the world outside blanked and reshaped by snow, the sky a blue so deep and total it looked painted. The ranch work continued, but more slowly, carefully, the way all things are done in deep winter, conserving energy, protecting the vulnerable things, keeping the warmth going. Jesse had been at the ranch for 4 months now. He thought about that number and what it meant. He thought about who he'd been on the bus, looking out at the landscape with a duffel bag at his feet and $40 in his pocket, and the tired, frightened certainty that he was going away from things but not toward anything. He thought about the first morning in this room above the stable, the aloneness of it, the strange, small relief underneath the aloneness. He thought about crying on a hay bale at 9 o'clock at night, and a massive man sitting down across the aisle and asking, plainly, if he'd eaten. He thought about what a question like that can mean. The right question at the right moment, offered without conditions. How much weight that can carry. How a person can be saved not by a grand gesture but by a simple one, by being asked if they've eaten, by being fed soup, by being shown how to read a horse's ear position, by someone sitting in the armchair near you while you sleep. He wrote to his mother. An actual letter, not an email. He found paper in the desk in his room and wrote 4 pages. The most honest 4 pages he'd written to her in years. He didn't explain everything. He didn't try to resolve everything in 4 pages. But he told her he was good. He told her where he was. He told her that he had found something he hadn't known he was looking for, and that it was worth keeping. He didn't know if she would understand exactly what he meant. He thought she might, more than she let on. He hoped so. He sealed the letter and put it in his jacket pocket to take to town on the next supply run. February arrived with a thaw, brief and premature. The kind of false spring that Montana does in midwinter, 2 or 3 days of warmth that open things up and then retreat, leaving everything wet and hopeful, and not yet ready. Jesse and Eli worked through it, and the thaw was good for the fence line. Opened up ground that had been too frozen to dig, and they spent 3 days in a row working side by side on the north pasture, rebuilding the section that Eli's father had built wrong in 1987. Working together that way, hands and tools and the ongoing problem of the fence, was its own kind of intimacy Jesse had come to understand. There were conversations they had most easily with their hands busy, when the eyes could go elsewhere and the words could come without the weight of being watched. They talked about the ranch's future on those days, Eli's plans for it, the things he'd been putting off since his father died, the ways he'd been managing alone that would be easier with two. Jesse listened and asked questions and contributed ideas he only partly knew were good, and Eli considered them all seriously, the way he considered everything Jesse said seriously, which was still something Jesse was getting used to. On the third afternoon of the fence work, Jesse was tamping a post in and he straightened up and stretched his back and looked out at the pasture, the flat white of it, the tree line dark at the edge, the big sky going golden at the edges with late afternoon, and he felt, with a sudden, complete certainty that was different from hope and different from relief, that this was his. Not in the legal sense, not in the sense of ownership, in the sense of belonging. In the sense that when he looked at that pasture, he felt something in him say, yes, this, here. He said this to Eli, standing out there. Eli looked at the pasture too, then he looked at Jesse. Took you long enough, he said. Jesse laughed. It came out surprised and genuine, the way his laughter always did around Eli. Took me long enough to say it. Yeah, Eli's expression was warm, the warmth not hidden at all anymore. That too. There was an evening in late February that Jesse would always come back to when he thought about the turning points. Though by then, there had been so many quiet turnings that isolating anyone was like trying to find the exact moment a river joins the sea. They had finished dinner and the dishes were done, and the radio was on, and neither of them was ready for the evening to end. Eli had been quiet at dinner, not unhappily, just thoughtfully, the kind of quiet that has something in it. Jesse had learned the different textures of Eli's silences the way you learn the different qualities of light in a place you've lived for a while. He waited. Finally Eli said, not looking at him, "My sister is coming in March, with her husband." "Okay," Jesse said. "She knows about me, she's known for a while." A pause. "She doesn't know about," he stopped. "She doesn't know about you." Jesse looked at him. The quiet between the words was dense. "What are you thinking?" Jesse said. "I'm thinking I want her to." Eli turned his coffee cup. "I want her to know what you are to me." Jesse felt the breath leave him slowly. "What am I?" he asked, softly, not provocatively, genuinely. Eli looked at him then, the unguarded look fully. "You're the reason I stopped being alone," he said. "That's what you are." Jesse held that for a long moment, the weight of it and the rightness of it. "Yeah," he said, "I'll be here when she comes." Eli nodded. His hand found the table and Jesse put his own over it, the way Eli had over his during the storm, and they sat like that for a while in the warm kitchen with the radio playing something old and the window dark with February and the horses breathing below and the land outside quiet under snow. The sister, Lena, arrived on a Saturday in the second week of March, with her husband Thomas, who was a large, friendly man who made furniture in Bozeman and had a laugh that carried across rooms. Jesse had been anxious in the days before their arrival in a way he tried not to let show and mostly succeeded. It was a specific, tender anxiety, not about being seen, not anymore, but about what it meant to be seen by Eli's family, about what that introduction represented for both of them. Lena was sharp-eyed and warm and looked like Eli around the jaw and eyes. She shook Jesse's hand when Eli introduced them. "This is Jesse. He's been out here since October, he's..." And there was the tiny pause, the breath, and then Eli said, steady and clear and unhurried, "Important to me." And Lena looked at Jesse and then at her brother and her face did something quick and private and then she smiled. "Well," she said to Jesse, "it's good to meet the person who finally got him to rebuild that north fence." It broke the tension cleanly. Jesse laughed. Thomas clapped Eli on the shoulder. And the afternoon moved from there into dinner and stories and the specific warmth of people finding their way to ease, and Jesse felt, across the table, Eli's knee against his under the tablecloth, simple, present, steady. When Lena and Thomas went to bed, Eli and Jesse were left at the kitchen table with the remnants of the evening around them. "That was okay," Jesse said. "Yeah," Eli said. He was looking at the table with an expression that was tired and relieved in equal measure. "More than okay," Jesse said. He was looking at Eli, at the ease that was settling back into his posture now that the hardest part had been done. That was brave. Eli looked up. "It shouldn't have to be brave," he said. "I know that." "It shouldn't," Jesse agreed. "And it still is anyway. Both things are true." He paused. "I'm proud of you." Something in Eli's face went vulnerable, briefly, in the way that something goes vulnerable when it has been held very tightly for a very long time, and someone touches it gently. "Thank you," he said. Spring came to the ranch the way it always does in Montana, tentatively, then all at once. The fence line was repaired. The pasture grass came up green and wet under the receding snow, and the horses moved through it with the particular energy of animals who have been inside too long. Jesse's hands, which had been soft the October he arrived, were now competent and calloused, and knew their way around everything on the property without instruction. He had been here 6 months. He thought about the index card sometimes, the handwritten words, farmhand needed, room and board provided, hard work expected. He had gone to that feed store with $40 and a duffel bag and no good plan, and what he had found, the room, the work, the horses, the kitchen table, the man who sat across from him, none of that had been on the index card. You couldn't put that on an index card. There wasn't a category for it. He called his mother on a Sunday afternoon in April, standing on the porch with the spring air around him and the east pasture green in the middle distance. "You sound different," she said. "Different how?" he asked. She was quiet for a moment. "Settled," she said, with something careful and wondering in her voice, like a word she'd been hopping to use for a long time and hadn't been sure she'd get the chance. "You sound settled." "I am," he said. Another pause. "Is there someone?" she asked, and her voice was not the voice of a woman with a map to a different version of him. It was just his mother asking about her son. "Yes," he said. "Good," she said, just that, and then more quietly, "good." The evening Jesse told Eli about Daniel, the full version, not the outline he'd given in the stable that December afternoon. They were sitting outside on the porch with the spring dark coming down around them and the first frogs of the season going in the distance. And Jesse found that it was easier than he'd expected, here, in this place, with this man. He told him about how it had started, the confidence of it, the all-in of being 20 and thinking you understood how love worked. He told him about the way it had changed, slowly, over months, the small erosions, the ways that Daniel had been one thing in the beginning, and then gradually, undeniably another. He told him about the last fight, which had been in a parking lot of all places, and how he'd gone home and looked at the rented room, and understood that he had lost the thread of who he was somewhere in the previous 2 years, and was going to have to find it again. Eli listened. He didn't reach for easy words. He asked 2 questions quietly, and they were exactly the right questions. When Jesse finished, they sat with it for a while. "The thing I need you to know," Jesse said carefully, "is that I'm not bringing that here. I'm not bringing him here or what that did. I've been trying to make sure of that." He paused. "But I also need you to know that some of what you've seen, the pulling back, the managing, the way I needed so long to say the simplest things, that was damage. That's not who I am underneath it." "I know," Eli said. "Do you?" "Yeah." Eli looked at him, the porch light through shadows. "I saw who you are underneath it the night I found you in the barn. Person who's been through something hard and is still here, still trying." He paused. "That's who you are. The rest is just weather. It passes." Jesse looked at the dark pasture. He felt something inside him settle with a finality he hadn't expected, not resigned settling, but the settling of something that has been in motion for a long time and has finally found its level. "Eli," he said. "Yeah. I love this place." "A beat." "I know," Eli said. "I love you too," Jesse said, quiet, clear, out here in the dark with the frogs and the spring. Eli was quiet for a long moment, the kind of quiet that is full, not empty. "I know that too," he said, And then, as if the admission cost him the last of his reserve of brevity, he said more. "I've been watching you figure out how to stay since the first week. I've been hoping you would. Every morning I've hoped it." He stopped, started again. "I'm not good at saying this kind of thing. I need you to know it's not because I don't mean it." "I know you're not," Jesse said. "That's why when you say it, I believe it." Eli exhaled, a slow, releasing breath, like a man setting down something he'd carried so long the weight had become invisible. "Good," he said, "then we're fine." Jesse smiled at the dark. "Yeah," he said, "we're fine." Spring moved into summer with that particular generosity the land sometimes has after a hard winter, everything coming up vivid and excessive, the pasture grass high and thick, the creek at the north edge of the property running fast with snowmelt, the sky so blue and enormous some mornings that Jesse still stopped and looked at it before he could help himself. The ranch ran differently with two people who were in it together. That was the thing Jesse noticed most, and had the hardest time articulating when he tried to think about it precisely. It wasn't that the work was easier. It was the same work, the same fence lines and water troughs and early mornings, and the particular physical demands of a place that needs constant tending. It was that the work had a different quality of attention now, because they were tending it together and knew they were, and that knowing made it different in a way that was both small and enormous. Eli taught him things all spring, the nomming of birds that Jesse would never have thought to learn, the particular way the creek ran in high water and what it meant for the lower pasture, the history of different sections of the property that Eli carried in him the way people carry family stories, partly conscious and partly not. Jesse taught Eli things too, which he hadn't expected to do. He knew how to build spreadsheets, which turned out to be genuinely useful for the ranch's supply management. He had grown up cooking actual food, as opposed to Eli's functional but limited repertoire, and he started taking over dinner twice a week, introducing dishes that made Eli look up from his plate with an expression of genuine surprise and reassessment. "Where did you learn this?" Eli said one evening, over something Jesse had made with poblanos and black beans and roasted corn that was not quite a chili and not quite a soup, but was extremely good. "My grandmother," Jesse said. "She cooked real food, the kind that takes 3 hours." "Marry her," Eli said, and then looked up and they both processed the word for a moment in the warm kitchen, and Eli's ears went very slightly darker, which was the closest thing he did to visible embarrassment, and Jesse smiled into his bowl. "I'll tell her you said so," Jesse said. Lena came back in July, this time without Thomas, for a long weekend, and she and Jesse discovered in the course of it that they got along as naturally as if they'd always known each other. She was easy in the way that people are easy when they have decided to be, without condition. She decided to like Jesse not because she was required to, but because she'd looked at him and at her brother and drawn the obvious, correct conclusion, and she moved from there with the directness that apparently ran in the family. She and Jesse talked while Eli was out doing the evening check on the water lines. Real talk, the kind that builds quickly between people who are being honest. "He's been different," she said, "since you came." "Different how?" Jesse asked. She thought about it. "More himself," she said. "That probably doesn't make sense from the outside." "It does to me," Jesse said. She looked at him. He spent a lot of years taking care of everybody else. The ranch, us, Dad. She turned her glass on the table. "I'm glad he has someone taking care of him for a change." Jesse thought about that for a moment. "I don't know if I take care of him exactly." "You're here," she said. "You chose this place and you stayed. For someone like Eli, that is the whole thing." She paused. "He'd never say that, obviously." "Obviously," Jesse agreed. She smiled. He smiled back. The screen door opened and Eli came in from the evening, boots muddy, hat in his hand, and he looked between them with mild suspicion. "What?" he said. "Nothing," said Jesse and Lena together. Eli looked at the ceiling briefly in the manner of a man who knows he is outnumbered, and has accepted it. There was a morning in late August, the summer going golden at the edges, that particular quality of light that comes at the end of things when they are about to change again. When Jesse woke before the alarm and lay in the warm dark above the stable and listened to the sounds of the ranch waking up around him, and ran through it all from the beginning. The bus, the index card, the dirt road, the barn, the hay bale, the lantern you eaten today. The soup, the horses, the east window, the first snow, the bonfire in the yard, the workshop and the old song and being caught singing it, the ladder in the hay loft and the hand on his shoulder and the name said plain, the wooden Christmas horse in the center of the tree, the storm and the kitchen and the two hands over the coffee cups. I'm the reason I stopped being alone. The spring and the frogs and the dark porch. The simplest, truest words he had said to another person in years. He got up and dressed and went down to the stable and started the morning. The horses greeted him, Clara with her steady knock against his shoulder, Smoke with his big trusting nose in Jesse's palm, Sunday and Rye turning in their stalls with the easy affection of old friends. He worked through the morning routine without thinking about the individual steps because they had become him, part of the physical grammar of his days, written in muscle and habit and knowledge. Eli appeared at the stable door at 20 minutes to 6, coffee in hand, hat on, the morning light behind him. He looked at Jesse the way he always looked at Jesse in the mornings, that particular, settled, glad expression that he didn't bother to arrange or qualify anymore. "Good morning," he said. Jesse leaned on the stable door. "Yeah," he said, "it is." The first frost of the following October, almost exactly a year to the day from when Jesse had walked up the dirt road with a duffel bag and $40, came early in the evening, and they stood on the porch and watched it settle over the east pasture in the last light. "It's been a year," Jesse said. "About," Eli agreed. They stood with the cold coming in around them, watching the land go still. Jesse thought about the version of himself who had walked up this road, frightened and without direction, carrying everything he'd broken and nothing he'd built. He thought about how that person had not known what he was walking toward, had not known that the end of the road held a barn and a lantern and a man who would ask a simple, practical, completely sufficient question. "You eaten today?" He thought about how small the turning points actually were when you looked back at them. Not drama, not revelation. Just a door opening and a choice made, and a question answered honestly. He turned his head and looked at Eli beside him, the strong, steady profile of him, the hat, the hands on the porch rail, the solidity of him that Jesse had stopped thinking of as a surprise and started thinking of as home. "I'm staying," Jesse said. It was not new information. It had been decided and redecided and settled many times over the course of a year. But he said it again, in the October cold, with the first frost on the pasture and the horses inside and the kitchen warm behind them, because some things are worth saying more than once. Eli looked at him, the warm, unguarded expression, the one Jesse had learned to find over 4 seasons and which he hoped to keep finding for whatever came next. "I know," Eli said. His hand found Jesse's on the rail. The land stretched out in front of them, frosted and still and going dark. The horses breathed in the stable below. The sky above the east pasture was the color of old copper, deepening to blue at the edge. They stood there together on the porch of the Calloway ranch, at the end of a dirt road that turned to mud when it rained, and watched the year turn over. And it was exactly, entirely enough. The end. Bell final hook. 1 year, 4 seasons, 2 men, 1 broken and 1 quietly waiting, a barn, a hay bale.
Did it break your heart a little? Did it fill it up? Drop in the comments. If you made it all the way here, you earned it. Subscribe so you never miss a story. Hit the like button if you want more slow burn romance from the heartland. Comment should I tell you what happened when Jesse finally goes home to Oregon and brings Eli with him. Thanks for watching and keep watching.